In 1991, journalist Danny Casolaro was sure that his investigation into the huge Octopus Conspiracy would uncover disturbing secrets hidden deep within the government. But what the brave investigative journalist didn't fully realize was that if you dig too deep into certain places and certain people, you're bound to get burned by the molten lava. This is a story straight from the dark side of America's underbelly. It's the tale of the Octopus Conspiracy and the strange death of Danny Casolaro. On the morning of August 10th of 1991, the cleaning staff at the Sheridan Inn in Martinsburg, West Virginia, was making their usual rounds. On the 5th floor, one maid pushed her cart to room 517, knocked on the door, and there was no answer. As she entered, and in front of her was a sight she was not expecting. There in the bathtub lay the naked body of a man, his wrists deeply cut several times and blood splattered across the walls and floor. The horrified maid let out a guttural scream before collapsing, fainting right there on the spot. This is how the lifeless body of Danny Casolaro was discovered. Authorities were pretty quick to rule this as something he had done to himself. There was no signs of a struggle and no evidence that anyone else had been in the room with Danny, and there was also a brief note jotted down on a legal pad that read, "To those who I love the most, please forgive me for the worst possible thing I could have done. Most of all, I'm sorry to my son. I know deep down inside that God will let me in." But what those authorities didn't know was that just a couple weeks before his trip to Martinsburg, Casolaro had told his brother that if anything happened to him, he shouldn't believe it was an accident. And so, what led Danny to this gruesome end, really? And the answer lay in the investigation that had taken up the last several months of his life, a sinister conspiracy that he called the Octopus. You see, Danny was a bit of a restless soul. He liked to be on the move, working towards a goal. It was just how he functioned. He had a passion for technology and journalism, always seeking to find the truth, and this sort of endless curiosity is what might have led him to people and places that didn't exactly like being looked into. He published regularly in magazines like National Star, the National Enquirer, and the Globe. He even started his own publishing company for computer and technology magazines called Computer Age Publications. And by the summer of 1990, at 43 years old, Danny was a veteran in his industry, searching for his next big story. He'd spent the past few decades unraveling complex investigations that needled in a few corners of the government, building a reputation for his determination and unique skill set in connecting the most tangled threads made Danny well respected among his peers and feared by anyone who might be dabbling in something they probably shouldn't. But nothing could have prepared him for the web of conspiracies he was soon about to uncover. A plot so vast and sinister that it threatened to expose some of the darkest secrets of the U.S. government and international organized crime. He was initially tipped off when a colleague suggested that Casolaro look into the Inslaw case, a small software company that had been battling the Department of Justice for most of the 1980s. The owners, Bill and Nancy Hamilton, had accused the government of stealing their innovative PROMIS software, which was short for Prosecutors Management Information System, and driving their company ultimately to bankruptcy. And what seemed like a fairly regular legal dispute on the surface, though, soon uncovered dark connections to other events. As Casolaro dug deeper, he found unsettling ties to seemingly unrelated events like the Iran-Contra scandal, the alleged October surprise hostage situation before the 1980 elections, and the collapse of the infamous Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Now, these cases all would need their own episode to really wrap your head around them, but in short, Casolaro started to think that all these scandals were connected by a big conspiracy involving corrupt government officials, shady intelligence agencies, and dangerous criminal organizations from all around the world. He named this suspected plot the Octopus because it was a sprawling network that seemed to reach everywhere around the world. This was much bigger than any magazine article, and so that's what he wanted to call his book, the Octopus. Though it was turned down by Little Brown Publishers in July of 1991 because it was likely too hot to take on, The Octopus promised to be the most explosive investigative story of the entire 20th century. And if it had come true, it would have really shaken things up and exposed what many people already suspect. And that's that the government is so big and answers to nobody. So, most likely, they're involved in all sorts of illegal activity, all in the name of making money. Alongside the Hamiltons and Casolaro himself, another key player in the Octopus Conspiracy was a man named Michael Riconosciuto, a scientist with a shady past in weapons and methamphetamine production. And he appeared in Casolaro's notes alongside Earl Bryan, close associate of former President Ronald Reagan. According to Riconosciuto, he and Bryan had been hired by Reagan officials in 1980 for a secret mission in Iran. The mission, dubbed the October Surprise, involved transferring $40 million to prevent a deal with the Carter administration to release American hostages before the elections. And that way, Carter couldn't look like the hero in the eyes of the American people and not be reelected. Riconosciuto also claimed to have altered Inslaw's promised software under orders from the Department of Justice, inserting back doors for spying on foreign governments buying the program. He alleged that this hacked version of the software had been sold globally, making huge profits for a group of corrupt intelligence officers. His accusations were scandalous, to say the least, and Casolaro plunged headlong into his investigation, determined to uncover the truth. His notes and documents became a labyrinth of names, dates, and cryptic details, reflecting the overwhelming complexity of the plot he was trying to unravel. Newspaper clippings, official documents, and frenzied scribbles piled up in chaotic stacks over the next several months, all pieces to a puzzle that was consuming him. But Casolaro couldn't stop. At this point, he was convinced he was on the verge of exposing one of the biggest conspiracies of the 20th century, a truth that would shake the very foundations of power in the United States and even beyond. Names like Robert Nichols, a weapons trafficker and former CIA agent, and Gene Tatum, an Air Force pilot involved in covert operations, cropped up repeatedly in his notes. According to reports, Casolaro believed that the hacked Promise software had been sold to Iraqi officials through a weapons dealer in Chile. And this allowed Saddam Hussein's government to spy on its own citizens and Western allies. And this lead also led Casolaro to investigate the death of another journalist, Jonathan Moyle, a man who was found dead in his hotel room in Santiago, Chile, while looking into alleged arms sales to Iraq. As he got closer to what he thought was the missing piece of the puzzle, Casolaro made plans to travel to Martinsburg, West Virginia, to meet with an anonymous source. This source supposedly had crucial information about the octopus, which he thought could finally expose the truth. According to some reports, weeks before his trip to Martinsburg, Casolaro had been getting threatening late-night phone calls, and some even witnessed by his housekeeper. And once a sinister voice on the other end threatened to cut up his body and throw it to the sharks. Despite the intimidation, the journalist knew he was onto something and that the end of the investigation was near in one way or the other. And as he got closer to the climax of this whole thing, the situation became even more dangerous and threatening for him. On August 8, 1991, just 2 days before his body would be found, Casolaro was getting ready for what could be the most important trip of his life. Olga, his loyal housekeeper and longtime neighbor, helped him pack a black leather bag, watching as he stuffed a thick stack of papers into a dark briefcase. Casolaro told her that he was headed to Martinsburg, West Virginia, to meet with a mysterious source who promised to give him the missing information he needed to solve his investigation. And despite the threatening phone calls interrupting them, Casolaro didn't let it stop him, and he left for Martinsburg as planned. And what follows are details of his last known but fragmented hours. It's known that on August 9th, Casolaro had lunch at a Pizza Hut, where he charmed the waitress by quoting a passage from The Great Gatsby. Later that day, around 2:30 p.m., he met with William Turner, an engineer from Honeywell, at the Sheridan Inn where he was staying. And Turner claims to have handed him some documents and briefly spoke with him, though the details of their conversation remains a mystery. And this meeting was just an additional one, not the big contact he would be seeing later. As the day went on, Casolaro was seen wandering around a restaurant in Martinsburg, alone and seemingly depressed as reported by a waiter to the police. Around 5 p.m., a cocktail waitress at the Sheridan saw him in the company of a man she described as possibly Arab or Iranian. Was this the mysterious contact Casolaro had been waiting for, or just a random stranger? It's not very clear. But then, that night, Casolaro had an encounter with Mike Looney, a fellow guest staying in the room next to his. In two brief conversations, separated by a few hours, Casolaro revealed that he was there to meet with an important source who would give him what he needed to crack the case. According to Looney, Casolaro said his source was supposed to arrive at 9 p.m. And soon after, Casolaro left Looney, saying he needed to make a phone call. When he came back a few minutes later, he looked upset. "My source might have stood me up," he said with a sigh. Casolaro and Looney talked until 9:30 p.m., after which Casolaro went back to his room. Around 10 p.m., he was seen for the last time buying a coffee at a nearby store. After that, no one knew where he went or what happened to him. Sadly, that night of August 9, 1991 was the last time he was seen alive. The next morning, his body would be found in that bathtub of room 517, and the rest is history. The authorities, of course, said he did it himself, but those who knew him well have never believed that. And to add to all the strangeness of all this, none of the journalist's documents were found in his hotel room or his car, and those same documents Olga had seen him pack before he left. And in fact, they've never been found. Right from the beginning, the circumstances surrounding the case were very odd and unsettling. The autopsy, done on August 14th, concluded that Casolaro had bled to death between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. on the day he was found. What many find interesting is the note he left was surprisingly short, especially for someone like Casolaro, who was a prolific writer. Early on, there were reports that FBI agents had questioned the ruling by local authorities, but their concerns were brushed aside by their bosses fairly quickly. And it gets worse. And Casolaro's body was embalmed by the funeral home, and a janitor cleaned his hotel room even before his family was told about his death. And so, of course, the rumors began to spread like wildfire. Some thought there might be a mafia link. Others went wilder, suggesting a shady CIA employee might have been hired to clean up after a murder by the agency itself. At Casolaro's funeral, his family saw strange scenes, like a fancy-dressed military officer arriving in a limo, putting a mysterious medal on the coffin, and then leaving without a word. As big media outlets started covering the story, the police had to revisit the hotel crime scene. They found out the rooms next to Casolaro's were rented that night, one by, of course, Mike Looney, and the other by an anonymous family. But no one there admitted hearing anything unusual. The plot thickened even more years later, when thanks to a Freedom of Information request, evidence surfaced that an unknown witness had visited Casolaro's hotel room on the night of his death. A police sketch of that person matched the description of a supposed expert in psychological warfare named Joseph Kuehler, known for getting information by infiltrating and manipulating his targets. According to some accounts, a friend of Danny said he briefly met Joseph at a local bar in their hometown weeks before his death. This fueled the prevailing and dark theory that most believe is the truth, that Casolaro was killed to silence his dangerous knowledge of illegal operations funded with taxpayer money. And considering Casolaro wasn't the only victim in these events, it also helps point to this being a real possibility. Back in March of '91, while Riconosciuto was still working with Casolaro, he planned to testify before Congress about the Inslaw case. But before he could present any evidence, he got arrested on drug charges, which could have easily been payback for his testimony. Meanwhile, while Riconoscudo was locked up, key people involved started meeting suspicious ends. Paul Marasca, Riconoscudo's partner, was found murdered in San Francisco. Alan Stendorf, a guy who gave classified info to Casolaro, was found dead in his car with a strange head injury. And Jonathan Moyle, the British journalist also tracking the Octopus story, was found hanging in a Chilean hotel closet. Despite all the loose ends and mysterious circumstances surrounding the journalist's death, in September of '94, the government decisively closed the Inslaw case and its investigation into the Octopus Conspiracy. The Department of Justice released a report strongly denying any conspiracy to steal Inslaw's software. They brushed off the evidence as not credible and concluded that there was no conspiracy involving government officials. That same report also supported the official version that Casolaro's death was done by himself, completely dismissing the need for an independent investigation into the suspicious circumstances. And so, end of story. Dissenting voices were silenced and troubling clues were just swept under the rug. The Inslaw case and Casolaro's death were officially closed, with the authorities declaring a firm "nothing to see here." But what do you think? Was the ever-determined and close to cracking the case open Casolaro just so stressed that he decided it was time to leave this earth? Or did the powers to be, likely someone in our own government, just decide he was stirring too many things up and it would be easiest to get rid of him? It wouldn't be the first time, and it definitely wasn't the last. So there was the Octopus Conspiracy and the strange death of Danny Casolaro. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you want more darker content, remember to go check us out on Patreon. It's free to try, and there's an entire library of strange stories you can dig through, plus new ones coming out each week. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one.